And as you've been engaged yourself as a professor in theological higher education, you've witnessed, no doubt, many different trends and trajectories, some that have come and gone, and others that are seemingly here to stay. How would you describe the health in general of theological higher education? And I'm speaking of evangelical or conservative theological higher education.
It's better now than it was 20 years ago. Well, that's a bit sweeping, but I would still say that. Or perhaps more accurately, there are large swaths that are better than it was. After all, Bethlehem didn't exist 20 years ago. The Southern Baptist schools were pretty much universally heading left on all kinds of critical issues. That's changed. Certain other seminaries were going through really difficult times for one reason or another, and most of them have snapped around. So that although there are challenges in the culture, yet the theological training institutions are, in my view, more stable, more faithful, more fruitful today than 20 years ago. Now, that doesn't mean there are no dangers today. There are new sets of challenges and so on, but I'm more optimistic now on the educational front than I was 20 years ago. And it's partly because of the different waves of students that have come through, too. I've been teaching for enough years now that I've seen the sort of charismatic wave go through from 40 years ago, and the Toronto Blessing wave went through, and the emerging church wave went through. The emerging church wave came along and said, in effect, shove over, you guys, we'll show you how it's done. And there are still traces of it around, but it's small potatoes. It's nowhere near the front end. The current wave that's coming through is remarkable. In some ways, it's a broken wave. When I started teaching at a seminary, the overwhelming majority of the students came from Christian homes, and many of them were themselves children of the manse. Today, the overwhelming majority come from non-Christian homes, or some of them very broken homes, got converted in Crusade or something, or InterVarsity at university or something like that, with very little steeped roots in a well-socialized Christian community, a local church. But on the other hand, this generation is not cocky. It's not saying, shove over and we'll show you how it's done. It's saying, mentor me, teach me. And many of them are asking with a Calebite spirit for the challenges. I'd like to plant a multiracial church in our inner cities. That doesn't sound like comfortable suburbia. I can't tell you how many of our students are interested in doing something in the Muslim world. That's not running and hiding. It's trying to do something with the 70 years and 10 that God graciously hands out. And so while there are all kinds of social criteria that are heading in the wrong direction, and it's easy to start developing an attitude, the world is falling apart, times are getting more difficult, and so on. And in some ways, that's true. At the same time, God is building up whole networks of church planters and young theologians and young men who want to become pastors, who are thinking theologically, want to learn how to teach the Bible. Where those two curves will meet, who only God knows that. But this is not a time to get discouraged about theological education. This is a time for intercessory prayer and pouring your energy into these people. I wish I were 25 and could start all over and do it again. I mean, this is a great time to be alive and serve. The nominalism in the culture is being squeezed out by opposition. That's not bad. It begins to make it a little clear who's a Christian and who's not, and how you can tell. And so that all of these things will engender debates, and they're sometimes painful, and people sometimes come down on the wrong side of this or that. But they're signs of health. They're signs of of forced discernment. I think it's a great time to be alive.
And do you see any major changes coming, say, in the next 20 years or so with regard to the way theological education has been done and the way it might be done in the future?
It's becoming, the delivery systems are becoming more diverse, with both good results and bad results. Standard sit-in-a-classroom seminaries will continue. But there's more that's being done in the digital world with both good results and bad results. We went through a stage, it's still around to some extent, but it's not as popular as it was, where the really large churches, the mega churches, were sort of training their own guys. Some of that became really sloppy. And so there is a recognition that there has to be some formal training in the languages and rigor and exegesis, historical theology, pastoral theology, and so on, that is beyond what most local churches can handle. And so some, like Bethlehem, started a school itself, but that is also a reflection of the fact that the schools are needed. We're not on the American frontier in the 1740s, where a lot of theological training was done precisely in the context of a local church, in a kind of mentoring from minister to apprentice. So there are going to be more and more diverse delivery systems. Things pitched for people, immigrants perhaps, who have limited access to English, and some immigrants come in from lower standards of education, and so on. There's going to be a multiplicity of forms of education. That doesn't frighten me. That to me is encouraging. There is a sense in which well-trained seminary graduates ought to be, at one level, working themselves out of a job as they create institutions and structures and training for more people. So we have to be wise and discerning about these things. There's another potential turning point down the road. In Illinois, because there's a standoff between the legislature and the governor, we're not getting any of the funds. No tertiary education establishment is getting any of the funds that are promised. So this is leading some universities not only to be digging into their reserves, but to be talking about sacking whole departments and having to close and this sort of thing. But that's a foretaste of what could come on several fronts. If, for example, the society does continue to lurch left, then any of the tax breaks or grants and gifts to schools, for example, that don't endorse homosexual marriage could eventually be cut off. And then you'll find a shakedown again as Christians have got to find money elsewhere or close their schools. I'm not saying that that's what's going to happen. It's just too early to say. As Walt Kaiser would put it, I'm neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet, and I work for a nonprofit institution. So I don't know that's what's going to happen, but we're getting a taste of something for slightly different reasons in Illinois that is causing shakedowns and thinking through finances and how you do things. And that could become a much more serious business in the future. The federal government is becoming more and more intrusive. And it's partly because tertiary educational institutions have sometimes been lazier and lazier and less disciplined. And so the government steps in and tries to tighten things up, but in the process becomes more and more bureaucratic. And you end up, Vanderbilt announced last year that it spent $40 million just in compliance. That's a lot of money in red tape compliance. So these things affect theological education as well. None of us is going to be entirely immune, but schools that are accredited face more such pressures than schools that are not, with some winners and losers on both sides. It's just a very complicated field, and I don't pretend to see how it's all going to shake out, but I think that it's going to be more diverse and more complex than we've been used to expecting for a while.